I worked as a food delivery driver in a small town on the outskirts of a larger city. I'd gone there looking for something temporary, but I ended up staying longer than I had planned. There was something about the freedom of the job, the fact that I was alone most of the time, driving down empty streets and delivering orders to all sorts of people. I liked that independence, the ability to disconnect a little from the world and just follow a routine. However, what I didn't expect was for an ordinary night of work to turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. It had been a slow day in terms of orders, and the sun was already setting when I received a request from a more remote area of town. It was an address I didn't recognize, but that wasn't unusual, as sometimes people living in more rural areas placed late orders. What caught my attention was that the order had been made over the phone. In a world where almost everyone uses apps to order food, receiving a phone order was rare but not unheard of. I wrote down the address, picked up the food from the restaurant, and set off to make the delivery. The drive started peacefully. The streets were empty, local businesses were closing, and the cold autumn wind blew through the trees, making the fallen leaves dance on the road. I enjoyed the tranquility of those nights, the moment right before the sun completely disappeared and shadows took over the landscape. However, as I got closer to the address, I felt a slight shiver run down my spine. Something about the place I was heading to didn't feel right. The address was on the outskirts of town where houses were more spaced out and the roads became narrower and darker. As I drove, I noticed the houses looked older, more neglected, as if they had been forgotten by time. The yards were overrun with weeds, windows were broken or boarded up, and the few cars I saw were rusted, parked by the sidewalks as if they hadn't moved in years. Finally, I arrived at the address. The house was halfway between what looked like a forest and a small dead-end street. It was an old structure, with peeling paint and a broken wooden fence surrounding the front yard. It seemed completely abandoned, but there was a faint light on inside which made me hesitate. It was late, and the only thing keeping me there was my responsibility to the order and the need to make a living. I had made deliveries to stranger places, I told myself, though something in the air told me I should leave. I turned off the car and got out, holding the bag of food. The night wind blew hard, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation. I walked toward the front door, but the closer I got, the heavier the air became. I felt like I was being watched, though I didn't see anyone around. It was a visceral feeling, as if the trees around me, the broken windows, and even the darkness itself were conspiring against me. The front door was in worse shape than I had imagined. The wood was rotten in some places, and the paint that had once been white had turned into a dirty yellowish gray. There was no doorbell, just a small rusty metal handle that creaked when I touched it to knock softly. My knuckles echoed in the silence like a muffled sound. I waited, feeling my heart start to beat faster. I didn't know why, but the silence that followed was unsettling. As I waited, I heard something. It was barely a sound, a low moan, as if someone were stifling a sob from inside the house. I stood still, straining my ears, trying to hear better. The wind had died down, leaving the night in a deadly silence. Then I heard it again. This time clearer, the cry of a child. I froze. The cry was weak, almost smothered, but full of anguish. It wasn't the kind of cry from a child throwing a tantrum or seeking attention. No, this was something much darker, deeper. It was the kind of cry that only comes from true pain, whether physical or emotional. My hand started trembling as I held the bag of food. I felt an urgency, a need to get away from there, but at the same time a part of me knew something was terribly wrong inside that house. I knocked on the door again, harder this time, hoping someone would come out quickly. But instead, the door slowly opened with a sinister creak. I stood there, staring at the dark interior of the house. I couldn't see anything beyond the threshold, only shadows that seemed to move, but it was hard to tell. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but the crying, that damn child's crying, kept echoing in my ears. Something was happening in there, something I couldn't ignore. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling more than I would have liked. There was no answer, just silence. Suddenly, I heard the sound of something falling, followed by a stifled groan. Goosebumps rose on my skin and a cold sensation ran down my spine. I swallowed, trying to calm myself. I was about to turn around and head back to my car when someone appeared at the door. It was a man, tall, burly, wearing a dirty t-shirt and worn jeans. His face was covered in sweat despite the cold, and his eyes were bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. He looked at me with an expression of impatience, almost hostility. "What do you want?" he growled. I raised the bag of food, trying to stay calm despite the growing fear that was taking hold of me. I brought the food order," I said, my voice barely audible. The man looked at me for a moment as if he didn't understand what I was saying. Then slowly he extended his hand toward the bag. As he did, I heard another weak groan behind him, clearer this time. The man turned slightly as if checking something behind him, and for a brief moment I was able to see inside the house. I saw something I couldn't immediately comprehend, but it left me frozen. Two small figures huddled on the floor, trying not to make any noise. They were two children. They were terrified. The man realized I had seen something, and immediately his posture changed. He suddenly stopped extending his hand for the food and took a step forward, as if he wanted to block my view of what was happening inside. His eyes, previously hostile, now gleamed with a latent threat. I knew at that moment that I was in danger, that something much darker was happening inside that house. "It's none of your business," he said in a low voice, his tone loaded with warning. I wanted to say something, anything to break the awkward tension that now hung between us. But the words got stuck in my throat. I felt as if my body were paralyzed, my feet glued to the ground while fear took hold of me. The man kept staring at me, as if waiting for me to do something. But I couldn't move. The groan of the children still echoed in my ears, and my mind was struggling to understand what I had just seen. Finally, with trembling hands, I handed him the bag of food. The man snatched it away without even looking at it. "Have a good night," I mumbled, backing away slowly. I turned and walked back to my car, but I felt his eyes still fixed on my back. I didn't dare run. I didn't want to give him a reason to chase me. But each step felt like an eternity. When I finally reached my car and slammed the door shut, my hands were shaking so much that I could barely put the keys in the ignition. I started the engine but didn't leave. I sat there with the lights off, staring at the house. Something wasn't right, I knew it. I had felt it from the moment I arrived, and now I had seen it with my own eyes. But what could I do? I was just a food delivery guy. I stayed in the car for what seemed like endless minutes, with my heart hammering in my chest and my mind racing, torn between what I knew I should do and what I wanted to do. The rational part of me was screaming at me to leave, to drive away as fast as possible and forget everything I had seen. After all, what else could I do? It wasn't my problem, it wasn't my responsibility, and the situation was clearly dangerous. Yet as I looked at the house through the fogged-up windshield, the memory of those children's groans kept haunting me. I could have convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it, that the fatigue of the night and the eerie atmosphere of the place had played tricks on my mind. But that wasn't it. I knew what I had seen, two children huddled on the floor, trying not to be seen, trying not to make a sound. And the most disturbing part was the fear I saw reflected in their small figures. That kind of fear couldn't be faked. I knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, gripping so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My survival instinct told me to leave, but there was something else, a sense of obligation that I couldn't ignore. I knew that if I left, those children would remain trapped in that house, with that man who had them clearly terrified. The image of those small bodies trembling in the shadows would haunt me forever if I didn't do something. I took a deep breath and pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911. As the first rings of the call sounded, doubt crept in. What if I was overreacting? What if it wasn't what I thought? But as I recalled the man's gaze and the faint groans I had heard, I knew there was no way this was normal. I couldn't ignore it. The operator responded calmly, and I tried to explain the situation as best as I could. My voice trembled as I told her what I had seen and heard, and as I did, I felt my heart beating harder, as if I were waiting for her to tell me everything was fine, that there was no reason to worry. But that didn't happen. The operator took my call seriously, assuring me that they would send a patrol as soon as possible. She asked me to stay in the car, away from the house, and not to approach it under any circumstances. I sat there, still holding the phone in my hand, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. I knew I had done the right thing, but now I found myself in a tense wait, with the house in front of me, dark and ominous, as if it were watching me too. Even though I was safe in my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Each passing minute felt heavier, and the fear grew inside me, not just for the children, but also for myself. I couldn't stop thinking about the man. I knew something about his look wasn't normal. There was something dark, something dangerous, as if he could become violent at any moment. I had been lucky to get out of there without him doing anything to me, but now that I had called the police, what would happen when he found out? I imagined he wouldn't take it well. I looked around into the night's darkness, searching for signs of movement, hoping to see the police lights appear at any moment. And then I saw it. The man had come out of the house. I hadn't noticed at first as my attention was divided between my thoughts and my phone, but there he was, standing on the porch, looking around as if searching for something. His body was silhouetted against the dim light from the open door, and though I couldn't clearly see his face from where I was, I knew his expression wasn't friendly. I felt a chill run down my spine when his gaze seemed to fix on my car. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come closer. I couldn't be sure if he had noticed I was still parked near his house, but every passing second seemed to stretch. My fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel, and I found myself checking again that the doors were locked. My eyes didn't leave him, watching as he stood still on the porch, observing. It was as if he were calculating something, maybe deciding what to do next. Then a sound broke the night stillness. Blue and red lights began flashing in the distance, and the sirens of the police patrols became audible as they approached down the road. The man noticed immediately. His body tensed, and I could see him quickly turn to re-enter the house, slamming the door shut. My heart pounded, but for the first time since I had arrived at that house, I felt a spark of relief. The police were here. I sat in the car, watching as 2 patrol cars stopped in front of the house. 4 officers got out, and with a mix of firmness and caution, they approached the front door. I knew I couldn't hear what they were saying from my car, but I saw them knock on the door and wait. The seconds ticked by, and finally the man opened the door. His posture had changed. He looked nervous, anxious. The officers talked to him for a few minutes, and although I couldn't hear the details, something about the way the police exchanged glances told me that something wasn't right. Then one of the officers gestured toward the inside of the house, and I could see the man starting to get agitated. His gestures became more abrupt, and then suddenly he tried to close the door. But the officers didn't let him. Within seconds, the situation escalated. 2 of the police officers forced the door open, while the other 2 grabbed the man and pushed him onto the porch. He resisted, of course, but it didn't last long. My stomach churned as I watched him being handcuffed and taken to one of the patrol cars. The man was yelling, cursing, but the words were unintelligible. My hands shook as I realized how close I had been to a much worse situation. Just when I thought the tension was over, I saw 2 more officers coming out of the house, but they weren't alone. Behind them, I saw 2 little figures, the same children I had seen huddled on the floor when the man had blocked my view earlier. The officers walked with them hand in hand, and although it was hard to see from where I was, I could make out the bruises on their faces, on their arms. One of the children kept crying, his sobs barely audible from the distance, but they were so heartbreaking that I felt a pressure in my chest. In that moment, the relief I had felt vanished, replaced by a sense of helplessness. I knew I had done the right thing by calling the police, but I couldn't stop thinking about what those children had endured. How long had they been living like that? What kind of abuse had they suffered before someone stepped in? Watching the officers take them to the ambulance left a bitter taste in my mouth, as if it wasn't enough. I stayed in the car until the whole scene was over, watching as the house was left silent and deserted, with only the echo of the sirens fading in the distance. I didn't dare move until I was sure everything had ended. My mind was numb from what I had witnessed. Everything had happened so quickly, and yet each second of that night felt eternal, as if every minute had been a battle between fear and the obligation to act. Weeks passed before I found out what had really happened in that house. One day while I was at my aunt's house, the topic came up during dinner. That's when she told me something that left me speechless. It turns out that those 2 children, the ones who had been rescued that night, had been put up for adoption. My aunt and uncle, who had been trying to adopt for years without success, had been chosen as their new adoptive parents. In that moment, everything clicked. I knew that those children, whom I had helped without even knowing it, were now in a loving home far from the terror they had known. Every time I see them running around the yard, laughing and playing like any normal child, I feel grateful. I know that night could have been very different if I hadn't made the decision to stay, to not ignore what my instincts were telling me. I worked for a small delivery company in a town where everyone knew each other's business. Delivering delights wasn't one of those big-name services like Uber Eats or DoorDash. It was more of a local operation, a private startup run by a couple from town barely staying afloat. You'd think the name itself would give off a friendly vibe, but there was something about food deliveries at night that always made me uneasy. The streets, once bustling with life during the day, turned grim and empty under the dim glow of the streetlights. My job was simple: pick up the food and deliver it. I had gotten used to the routine, driving through quiet neighborhoods, watching the lights in houses flicker on and off as people settled into their nightly routines. Most customers were friendly, waving from their doors or even offering a thank you from behind a mask. Over time, you start to recognize people. Small towns are definitely like that. You learn their habits: the ones who order pizza late at night, the families who always want extra fries, the guy who gave you $5 extra if you made no noise. But of course, there were always strange people who made you uncomfortable. I avoided certain neighborhoods, especially after dark. But then there was Selena. Selena lived in an old part of town right next to the high school, where the houses had clearly seen better days. The yards were neglected, abandoned by their owners. She always ordered fish and chips. Always. And every time she had the same instructions: knock on the door and wait for her to come out. Pretty standard, except she lingered for a bit longer. She'd invite me in with that strange smile stuck on her face, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I always refused, making up some excuse about having other deliveries. There was something in the way she looked at me, like she was sizing me up like a wolf eyeing a lamb. One night, when business was pretty slow, I got a notification: new order, fish and chips for Selena. I almost declined. The clock read 10:15 p.m. and I only had an hour left on my shift. It was a big order, bigger than usual. Desperate to make up for the lousy tips that night, I accepted the delivery against my better judgment. I stopped at the restaurant, my stomach already uneasy. The street was dark and the flickering neon sign cast an unsettling, jagged shadow across the parking lot. Even the restaurant seemed quieter than usual, almost like the whole town was asleep, except for me and Selena. I grabbed the heavy brown bag, already dripping grease through the paper, and headed to her house. Selena's house stuck out like a sore thumb in the neighborhood. It was a rundown, 2-story house with peeling paint and broken shutters hanging from the windows. I imagined it had to be the cat's. The porch light barely lit up the steps as I parked in front of the house. I hesitated. Something about the house felt different that night, darker, like it had been waiting for me. There were garbage bags all over the porch and a small recliner rotting next to the front door. The place was pretty disgusting, top to bottom, but it completely matched the woman who lived inside. I took a deep breath, shaking off the shiver running down my spine, and grabbed the order. As I climbed the porch steps, I noticed a sour stench in the air, almost like rotting meat mixed with something else. Sweat, maybe? I couldn't quite place it, but it was the kind of smell that made your skin crawl. I knocked once and the door opened on its own. It was the last thing I wanted to happen. It wasn't the first time Selena's door had been left unlocked, but that night it creaked open inward slowly, as if it had been waiting for me. The darkness inside was total. The streetlight barely penetrated past the threshold, swallowed by the shadowy gloom beyond. The smell hit me harder now, thick, rancid. "Selena," I called, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. No response. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. "Selena, I brought your food." I should have left, I know that now. But at that moment I thought maybe she had fallen or was too sick to get to the door. And despite everything, I didn't want to leave the food outside. My eyes adjusted to the dim light coming from somewhere inside the house, the flicker of a lamp or maybe the TV. But the living room was worse than I had ever seen it before. Clothes and papers were strewn across the floor, half-empty food containers, empty bottles. I set the food down on the kitchen counter, clearing a small space among the mess. My feet almost sank into the carpet, which was damp with something I didn't want to think about. As I made my way down the hallway, I saw shadows move at the edge of my vision, almost like something lurking just out of reach. By this point, I was convinced she was hurt, maybe had fallen. "Selena," I called again, this time more urgently. From somewhere deep in the hallway I heard it, a faint voice, barely a whisper. "Here. Help me." It was her voice, but it didn't sound right. It was too weak, too distant, almost like she was calling me from the bottom of a well. I hesitated at the hallway's entrance, glancing at the front door, which now seemed farther away. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But then I thought, what if she really needed my help? I stepped down the hallway, the walls seeming to close in around me. The smell was unbearable now, like an infected wound left to rot. I reached the bedroom door, slightly ajar, and flickering light spilled from inside. I pushed it open slowly. There she was, lying in bed, the sheets tangled around her massive body. Selena, her body barely covered, her skin pale and slick with sweat. She smiled weakly, but it wasn't a smile of gratitude. It was something else. "Come in," she said, her voice thick and slurred. "I need you." I froze, my stomach churning even more. There was something deeply wrong in the way she was lying, in the way she looked at me. I took a step back, my heel catching on the edge of the carpet. She was completely naked, all her parts fully exposed, beckoning me with a finger to join her in bed. I brought your food," I stammered, backing out of the room. "I should go." Suddenly a voice cut through the silence, low and rough, from somewhere behind me. "Don't leave, she needs you." I turned around immediately, and there in the shadows at the end of the hallway was a man. I recognized him instantly. A homeless guy I'd seen hanging around downtown, wandering aimlessly. His clothes were filthy, his face unshaven, but what stood out most was the way he looked at me. His eyes were wide, gleaming with something manic, something desperate. There aren't many homeless people in our small community, so it was easy to remember where I knew him from. Still, something was off, like he was out of his mind. "She needs you to stay," he said again, stepping forward, his dirty hand reaching out toward me. "You can help her." I backed up against the doorframe, my pulse pounding in my ears. "No, I began to say, but he interrupted, his voice rising in pitch. "She's sick, don't you see? You have to give her what she needs." Then he winked. I felt my body tense as he moved closer. His steps were deliberate, his breathing ragged. I glanced toward the bedroom where Selena was still watching me with that strange smile, her hand still beckoning me to come closer. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the air growing thicker. This wasn't just a strange request. It was something else, something much darker and totally depraved. Finally, my back hit the wall and the weight of the situation crashed down on me. I was trapped. The man kept advancing, his dirty clothes reeking of sour sweat and something else. His breath was hot and heavy, filling the narrow hallway as he muttered again, "You have to help her. You came to help her, didn't you? Give her what she wants, delivery boy." "I'm just the delivery guy," I managed to stammer, my throat dry. "I'm just here to drop off the food and I really need to go. I've got other deliveries." "The deliveries can wait," he growled, his voice suddenly sharp, slicing through the oppressive air like a knife. He was only inches from me now, close enough for me to see the sores on his skin, the yellow tint of his eyes as he scanned me like I was his prey. "Selena's hungry. She's been waiting for you. Give it to her, man, and let me watch." Behind me, Selena's voice rang out, syrupy sweet. "Please don't go." She drew out every word, each syllable dripping with a mix of desperation that made me shiver even more. "Stay a while, you'll like it. We'll take care of you." I turned my head toward her. She had pulled herself up to a half-sitting position, her large pale body barely covered by the thin sheet now tangled around her legs. The dim light in the room reflected the sheen of sweat on her face, and for the first time I saw the extent of the filth she lived in. The bed was stained, large dark patches on the mattress, and there was an overwhelming smell of mold and rot that seemed to ooze from every corner of the room. I gagged as bile rose in my throat. The man's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. His grip was sticky, his dirty nails digging into my skin. "You can't leave," he growled, pulling me toward the room. "Selena wants you to stay." "No!" I finally shouted, yanking my arm free with all the strength I could muster. The sudden movement made me stumble backward, my shoulders slamming into the doorframe. "I'm not staying. I'm not part of this. Have your own fun." The man's face twisted into a ghastly snarl, his lips curling back to reveal yellow, cracked teeth. "You can't leave," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous now. "Not until she gets what she wants. Give it to her, damn it. Just do it." I didn't want to know what that meant. I turned and ran down the hallway, my feet pounding the worn carpet as I sprinted toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear the man's heavy footsteps, his ragged breathing chasing after me. Selena's voice followed me, sickly and sing-song. "Come back. Don't run." I reached the front door and fumbled with the handle, my hands shaking. The cold night air hit my face just as I was about to escape, and then I felt a hand grab my shirt, pulling me back. I turned just in time to see the man, his eyes wild, trying to drag me back into the house. "Come on, man," he shouted, a burst of desperation in his voice. With one final burst of strength, I managed to free myself from his grip, stumbling down the porch steps and running toward my car. I fumbled with the keys and finally got the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming and locking the door immediately. The man stood at the edge of the porch, his shadow long under the dim light, his eyes fixed on me, filled with a crazed intensity. For a moment we stared at each other, the air between us thick with tension. He didn't move, just stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as he continued to watch me. Then slowly he lifted his hand and pointed at me, his lips curling. "You'll come back," he said, his voice barely audible through the closed window of my car. "You'll come back." I didn't waste another second. I started the engine and sped out of the driveway, my tires screeching against the asphalt as I drove away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The image of Selena and that man, whatever they had been planning to do, was burned into my mind. I just kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. When I finally pulled into the parking lot behind the Delivering Delights office, I felt like I could breathe again. That oppressive weight that had followed me into the house seemed to lift completely. But the feeling of unease, the sensation that something was crawling up the back of my neck, remained. I sat in my car for a while, my heart finally slowing down, trying to make sense of the whole situation. How had I ended up in that situation? Sure, I delivered there before, but this was obviously completely different. It wasn't just an awkward old woman being inappropriate, it was something else, something dark and insidious. Who the hell was that guy? I pulled out my phone and called my boss, the owner of Delivering Delights. Even though it was late, the phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Yeah, what's up?" "I just left Selena's house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was still shaking. "Something weird happened, and I think she's got a guy staying with her. He tried to grab me and I barely got away." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean there was a guy?" "I don't know who he is," I said, now the words tumbling out in a rush. "I've seen him around town. I think he's homeless, but he was there and he tried to drag me back into the house. He told me I couldn't leave." My boss sighed heavily. "Look, man, Selena definitely has some issues, okay? We've had problems with her before, but nothing like this. I'll talk to the cops and see what they want to do. In the meantime, take the rest of the night off and we'll figure it out." I hung up, not feeling any more reassured than before. As I sat in my car in the dark, the weight of what had just happened finally sank in. I could still feel the sticky grip of that man on my arm. I could still hear Selena's haunting voice calling me, begging me to come back. I didn't even go straight home. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of town, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched, the feeling that something was following me. Every time I passed a dark alley or an empty corner, I half expected to see that man standing there waiting for me. The next morning, I went back to the office to talk to my boss. I needed some kind of closure, some explanation, anything that could make sense of the craziness I had experienced the night before. When I walked in, my boss was sitting behind his desk, looking more tired than usual. "Did you hear anything from the cops?" I asked, sitting down in front of him. He nodded slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, turns out Selena's been letting that guy stay with her for a while. Apparently she met him in town a few days ago and brought him back to her place, and they've been, involved." "Involved?" I repeated, immediately feeling my stomach churn. "Yeah," my boss replied, clearly uncomfortable. "It's weird and gross, but they're consenting adults. Not much we can do about it. The police went over to talk to them, but they didn't arrest the guy. Technically, he wasn't doing anything illegal." I shook my head, trying to process what he was telling me. "So that's it. Nothing's going to happen, nothing illegal. He grabbed me, chased me, tried to drag me back into the house." My boss leaned back in his chair, looking at me with tired eyes. "Look, I get it. It's creepy, but there's not much more we can do. Just stay away from her from now on, okay? If she orders again, I'll send someone else. As for pressing charges, it's your word against theirs." and they're both saying he never touched you. It is what it is." I nodded, but the sense of unease still gnawed at me, refusing to go away. I left the office and headed home, and I ended up quitting the next week. I just couldn't keep delivering after that, after everything that had happened. I never saw those two people again, and if I ever do, I'm definitely running in the other direction. About 10 years ago, I used to deliver pizzas for a small independent place near Beacon Hill in Boston. If you live near Charles Street, you might know the place I'm talking about. Anyway, it was a pretty good job. The place was almost always busy, and the boss was an amazing guy, so we ended up making a decent wage, plus the tips we earned. One night during my shift, things got weird, really weird. Even though my job title was just delivery driver, the other drivers and I justified our inflated salary by helping out around the store during quiet periods. We helped with cleaning, assisted the kitchen staff by prepping their ingredients, and occasionally helped answer the phone to take delivery orders. So, during one shift, the phone started ringing while I was helping to clean one of the pizza ovens. No one rushed to answer it, so I wiped my hands and hurried to the counter to pick up the call. When I answered, I could barely understand the guy on the other end. He sounded really old with a raspy, deep voice that made it seem like he'd had some kind of throat surgery at some point in his life. I did my best to understand what he was saying. I really did, turning up the volume on the receiver and plugging my other ear with a finger. But I didn't catch a single word. Absolutely nothing. I ended up giving him a sincere apology before telling him I'd pass him to the manager. I handed the phone to my manager and stayed close to make sure it wasn't just me who couldn't understand the old man on the line. My boss greeted him, but then a confused expression appeared on his face as the guy began to speak. "Excuse me, sir, I think the line is bad. Could you repeat that?" He kept his courtesy at first, but like me, he soon lost patience with the poor old man. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I can't understand you. Let me take you to the office where it's a bit quieter." He covered the receiver so the guy couldn't hear and made a few comments about how this guy needed meals on wheels, not pizza delivery. He headed to his office with a grin as I continued with the daily cleaning tasks. About 15 minutes passed before the boss came out of his office. I thought he was going to tell me how he hung up on the guy after struggling to understand him, but he was still on the phone. "Yes, sir, of course, sir. Right away, sir. We'll keep you informed. Thank you for your business. Goodbye." I thought it was a different call. There was no way it was the same guy with the raspy voice. Taking an order doesn't take a full 15 minutes. I asked my boss what the deal was with the old man who had called and if he had managed to understand anything he was saying. He didn't respond, just put on his jacket and told me to watch the store while he headed downtown. I asked where he was going and he only replied, "Chinatown. Won't take long." There's only one reason my boss would drive to Chinatown so late: ingredients. There are a few night grocery stores in that area, some of which sell quality products at a good price. Except I had been helping prepare all the ingredients with the chef and knew full well that we weren't out of anything. When he returned, he was carrying one of those airtight coolers, the kind we use to pick up fresh anchovies and shrimp from the fish market. Then he asked us to make a basic cheese pizza and bring it to his office when it was ready. We didn't ask questions. The boss usually ordered a pizza in his office during the last part of the shift, and he typically asked for different things each night, so we didn't think much of his request. I packed up the pizza, brought it to his office, and knocked on the door. When he opened it, a repulsive smell hit me. Honestly, it was the most nauseating odor I'd ever smelled. Before I had a chance to ask, he grabbed the pizza box from my hands and slammed the office door in my face. Whatever stank so badly had spread through the entire back area of the store to the point where the chefs were shouting and asking who'd let one rip. They weren't too far off. The smell reminded me of when my apartment building's septic tank got backed up. It really smelled like sewage or something equally rotten. I really wanted to know what that smell was, but I had no intention of going near the boss's office again to get hit by another wave of that stench. But when he came out of the office, that smell began to spread through the back of the store again, and with a pained expression on his face, he asked the two drivers on duty, myself included, who wanted to make a delivery. By that point, it was clear that whatever reeked so badly was in the pizza. The other driver flat out refused. He delivered in his car and knew well that it would take days, maybe an entire week, to get that smell out of the interior. My boss was panicking at this point after all. We had a dine-in restaurant, and we were at risk of the smell spreading to that area. He promised me a big nightly bonus if I delivered the pizza. but I demanded to know exactly what was on that thing before taking it to the guy's house on my scooter. He took me to the alley behind the pizzeria and explained. Turns out the guy had ordered durian on his pizza. Yeah, he had to explain that to me too. Apparently durian is a fruit native to Southeast Asia, which is why my boss had to go to Chinatown to get one. They're huge with a spiky texture on the skin, but you can buy pre-prepared pieces of the inner pulp at certain Asian grocery stores. I've read that some people find the fruit smell sweet and fragrant, but I'm not one of those people, far from it. But I needed the money, so I took the pizza to the front, put it in the storage compartment at the back of my scooter, and drove to the address I was given. When I knocked on the house, the door was answered by a decrepit old man with small plastic tubes running from his nostrils to an oxygen tank. I had my suspicions for a moment, but then he spoke, and I knew it was the old man who had called an hour earlier, the one I could barely understand. He smiled broadly when I handed him the box, and instead of the usual fold of bills they typically hand over, he passed me this thick envelope clearly stuffed with cash. No change needed, he said in a raspy voice, holding a finger to his throat. Tips included. I opened my mouth to thank the guy, but the words got stuck in my throat. I was already struggling with the stench of that durian pizza, but watching the guy start to drool when the smell hit him, I can't remember ever feeling so disgusted. I managed to mumble, "Thanks, enjoy," before I nearly gave in to the urge to vomit right in front of him. It was weird, but I didn't want to insult him. Not when he was such a generous tipper. It was a generous tip. Not long after handing the envelope to my boss in his office, he came out with 3 crisp $100 bills. They were mine. It felt pretty good to get such a generous tip, but one feeling overpowered that. I ended up knocking on my boss's door for a serious conversation. I bluntly told him that I would not deliver that kind of pizza again. The stench was clinging to the storage compartment at the back of my scooter, and since it was summer, nearly everyone I passed at a slow enough speed complained about smelling something rotten. $300 was a sweet tip, but I'd spend a third of that on cleaning products for every durian delivery. Fortunately, my boss gave in. He told me that he too had found the whole thing pretty distressing, but that the guy had basically made him an offer he couldn't refuse. We hit our weekly target 3 days early thanks to this guy, my boss explained. But he promised we wouldn't make any more trips to Chinatown to buy durian just for one customer with too much money. So nothing more was said about it, and we didn't get any more calls from the guy. That is, until about 3 months later. It was practically the same scenario as the night he first called. Slow business, helping with cleaning and food prep, when the phone rang again. I answered, only to hear the familiar raspy voice on the other end. I knew instantly who it was this time without hearing another word of what he said. I simply informed him politely that I would transfer him to the manager and thanked him for his patience. Knocking on the boss's door, I covered the phone's receiver with my hand and whispered the words, "Hey, it's the durian guy." My boss, in turn, rolled his eyes and nodded as if to say, "I'll take care of it." I went back to my cleaning tasks with a grin, thanking everything holy that I wouldn't have to drive all over Boston smelling like a porta potty. You can see where this is going, right? The boss comes out of his office with a pained expression on his face, repeating the old, "Yes, sir. No, sir. Right away, sir." My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming. I remember shaking my head before he even asked, listing 1,000 ways to say no, cutting him off before he asked the question. Number, no way. Not a chance. Not today. Not me. He doubled the amount, my boss replied. What am I supposed to do? I couldn't believe it. If what he said was true, I'd get a $600 tip from this guy. $600. That was a little more than my monthly rent. With about 20 minutes of work, I'd cover roughly 3/4 of my living costs. The boss was right. What were we supposed to do? So once again, the boss drove down to the night grocery store in Boston's Chinatown to pick up this mysterious durian fruit I had read so much about. While I waited, I grabbed a handful of air fresheners we normally placed in the bathroom and began decorating the back of my scooter with them. I also took an entire can of Febreze from our cleaning supplies, planning to spray it tactically every time I stopped at a traffic light. Last time, a convertible caught the smell of the durian in the air, and the girl in the passenger seat nearly vomited on the car's floor. I really started preparing for the whole thing myself, prepping the pizza base, opening the back door, and turning the kitchen exhaust fans up to maximum to minimize the chances of the stench spreading through the store again. But this time, when I arrived at the delivery address, curiosity got the best of me. I had to take a peek at this guy's pizza, just to see what durian looked like. This was on the street, a block from the address in an open space, so I didn't expect the smell to be as intensely bad. To make a long story short, whatever was on that pizza wasn't durian. As I mentioned, I had Googled the fruit when I got home to learn more about durian. What was on that pizza was some kind of meat, not the creamy yellow pulp of durian. This thing was brown, blackened around the edges, and clearly some kind of aged or decaying meat. I closed the box and tried not to think about what I saw, handing it over to the old man, watching him start to drool again as he passed me the envelope, even thicker this time, filled with bills. As soon as I returned to the pizzeria, I banged on my boss's door. He answered with an irritated look on his face, given how hard I had knocked, but I didn't care. I had questions, lots of them. Durian, huh? Yeah, we talked about this. It stinks, but we're making a ton of money off this guy's order. I told him I knew that was nonsense, that I had Googled durian the same night I delivered to the guy for the first time, that I knew full well what it looked like, and that whatever was on that pizza was certainly not durian. He sighed, breaking eye contact. What was on that pizza, man? He didn't respond. I asked him if it was legal. He didn't respond. Without a word, he took my $600 from the envelope and handed it to me. I took it, but only after giving him 1 week's notice that I would quit if he couldn't be honest with me. I couldn't keep working there. We barely spoke another word to each other during the rest of my time working there. In my last days, he reeked of alcohol whenever we passed each other in the back. Whatever it was had clearly taken a serious toll on my boss's mental health. A year later, I was working in a decent little office downtown. Nothing to brag about, but it paid much better for essentially being a copy assistant. That, and the worst smell I had to encounter was printer toner and my coworker's coffee breath. But one hot summer night, driving home to my apartment with the car windows down, a smell hit my nose. Something so awful that I started coughing and choking while stopped at a red light. I looked around, seeing a guy riding a small scooter. The rear storage compartment had the logo of the pizzeria I used to work for. The stench was horribly familiar to me. It was the smell I once thought was durian, and the same stench I had come to learn was definitely not durian. When you think about it, the idea of someone delivering food to you is objectively a bit unsettling. Think about it for a second. A complete stranger is preparing your food, another complete stranger is driving to your location, and then you have an interaction with a stranger who is just a foot away from you. What's even more unsettling is when this happens, and you didn't even order any food. About 5 years ago, I was dog sitting for my former roommate. I didn't mind at all since I figured I'd just stay at his place. I had lived there for 2 years, so I didn't feel weird or anything, and he had the dog while I lived there, so I already had a great relationship with the little dog. In my mind, this was going to be easy. His dog was basically the easiest dog in the world to take care of. I swear she was part cat or something. You could fill her food bowl once, and she'd eat it throughout the day. Most dogs I've seen go crazy when you fill their bowl, but not this little dog. She never barked and only needed to go out twice a day to do her business. At that point in my life, I was also looking for some space and alone time, as I was nearing the end of a long-term relationship. I thought that space was exactly what I needed for a few days to clear my mind. The house was beautiful. It had a finished basement with a comically large fireplace next to a huge TV. I thought I'd set myself up there for the few days I was house-sitting. My job was boring at the time, and it could be done from my computer at home, so I set up my laptop, grabbed some snacks, and basically lived in the basement for a few days with the dog. By Friday night, I was feeling a bit lonely, since I'd been there since Wednesday and hadn't left the house or seen anyone. I called a couple of friends to watch some college basketball games and just hang out for the night. We ordered pizza and wings around 7:30 in the evening, and they were delicious. However, this isn't the unfortunate part of my story. My friends left around midnight. I cleaned up a bit, and then I decided to get ready for bed. Once I lay down on the couch, I ended up turning on my laptop and starting some work, simply because I wasn't tired yet. A little after 1 in the morning, I thought I heard the doorbell through my headphones. I took off my headphones and stayed still for a moment, my heart starting to race. When almost a minute passed and I didn't hear anything, I felt much better. I figured it must have been a noise or something in the music I was listening to that sounded like a doorbell. But then I heard it again, clear as day. A doorbell. Being in the basement, I had the slight advantage of being able to see the driveway. The window was just above my head, but if I stood on tiptoe, I could see the driveway. So to my surprise, more than to my horror, there was a car running in the driveway, with the headlights on. I couldn't make out what kind of car it was from where I stood because of the bright lights. My first thought was that one of my friends who had been there earlier had come back. I thought maybe they'd forgotten their phone or something and had come back for it. I went upstairs and cautiously approached the door. I had all the lights off upstairs and only the outside light above the front door was on. As I got closer to the door, I couldn't make out any details of the person at the door. It looked like they were wearing a hoodie and then another brown jacket over the hoodie. When I got to the door, I cracked it open. Luckily, there was another screen door in front of that door, which was also locked. "Can I help you?" I said with some hesitation in my voice. The person grabbed the handle of the screen door, noticed it was locked, and took a small step back. At that moment, I didn't even find it alarming. It just happened so quickly that I thought it was an instinct for them to open the door. They made a small noise, I think, and then said in a nearly timid voice, "Hey, I've got your small pizza and wings." Then they lifted a brown paper bag that was rolled up at the top. I was still trying to make out the details of their face, but they kept their head tilted downward at an angle. With a very annoyed voice, I said, "It's 1 a.m. I didn't order a pizza." The guy looked nervously around and then back at me and said, Yeah, you did. This is the address I have on the order." Then he went on to repeat the address, which was, in fact, the address of the house I was in. But I shut the door in his face and yelled, "Well, you've got the wrong address, good night." I went back to the basement and I was incredibly annoyed at that point. Just as I sat down on the couch, the doorbell rang again. I went back to the window and saw that the guy's car was still there. Thankfully, the dog was sleeping through this whole doorbell ordeal, so I didn't have to deal with a barking dog on top of everything else that was going on. I called my friends and asked if they had pulled a prank on me, knowing I'd be alone at the house. But all my friends who had been there were already home and in bed. It's also worth mentioning that my friends aren't the type to really pull pranks like that, especially not something as elaborate as this. Then I tried calling the pizzeria we'd ordered from earlier. Maybe something weird happened in the system, and they accidentally put my address on someone else's order. But when I looked up the number online, they had closed at 10 that night, so it wasn't that pizzeria. Only about 2 minutes had passed since I last looked out the window, but the car was still there. And then the doorbell rang once more. I thought about going back upstairs, but I noticed the delivery guy was finally returning to his car. The relief didn't last long, though. He got into the car, turned it off, and then just sat there. He didn't leave, and it looked like he was talking on the phone. I was hoping that maybe he really was a delivery guy and just had the wrong address, and he was talking to his boss or something. Call me crazy, but I don't think I've ever met a delivery driver who was that persistent. I tried to see the license plate number, but it was a little faded. I could only make out that it started with JC, but that's all I could distinguish. Finally, he backed out of the driveway and left. I was a little worried, though, because he left very slowly and didn't turn on his lights. He just rolled away in the car. I thought this uncomfortable situation was finally over, and I was no longer in the mindset to work, so I decided I'd finally try to sleep. I turned off the TV and sat down to listen to some music by a soft fire. Between songs, I thought I heard a car engine. I got up from the couch and looked out the window, and there was the same car again, this time parked in front of the house with no lights on. I snuck up to the owner's room to see if I could get a better view. I'm not sure if he saw me, but then he left again. I hid behind the curtain and looked out the window for the next half hour, and the car kept driving by every few minutes. At that point, I was scared because I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed the dog and my laptop, locked the door to the upstairs bedroom, and barricaded myself in. I was paranoid, but I felt safer doing this. Shortly after 2:30 in the morning, the doorbell rang again. I looked out the window and didn't see any car this time. Then I heard a bunch of banging on the door, and then that same voice from earlier said loudly, "Your pizza, I've got your delivery, sir. Your food's getting cold." I sat silently and didn't make a sound. I should have called the police at that point, or at least told the guy I was calling the police, but it wasn't my house. And I had never called the police before, so I just wasn't thinking clearly. Then the banging stopped. I didn't hear the voice anymore, and I didn't see the car. It was as quiet as could be, and I sat there staring at the ceiling all night until the sun came up. I fed the dog and let her out in the backyard quickly. I looked around for a few minutes while we were outside, then rushed back inside. I made sure she was okay and then decided I was going to leave. He was coming back later that night from his trip, and I didn't want to stay in that house a minute longer. When I left, I nearly tripped over something as I went out the front door. There was a rolled-up paper bag on the front steps. I opened it, and it only had an empty container where the wings go, sitting at the bottom of the bag. I felt sick as thoughts flooded my mind, thinking of everything that could have happened. I drove off, and when I reached the end of the street, I saw what I thought might have been the car from the night before. It was a dark sedan with a license plate starting with JC. I called the homeowner immediately, and he didn't seem too concerned, so we just talked about it for a bit. And I left it at that. Nothing ever happened again related to that incident. I've asked my friend countless times if anyone has shown up at his house since that night, and he said he's never experienced anything like that. I have no idea what happened, what kind of danger I was actually in. It was the most uncomfortable and terrifying night of my life. I know it may sound irrational, but I still haven't ordered pizza or any kind of food delivery since then. Once I was chased like in the movies. Let me give you a little background about myself. I'm an 18-year-old student. To make some money, I work delivering pizzas at night and on weekends. Note, I ride a motorbike to make deliveries, so my top speed is around 50 kilometers per hour. Here's the story. It was a warm summer evening. The sun had almost set, so visibility was poor in some directions. I knew the street I was on very well, and knew that ahead there were narrow roads. What I didn't know was that a car was speeding towards me from the opposite direction with its headlights off. I simply didn't see them because the sun was blocking my view. We almost had a head-on collision at full speed, and with me being on a bike, I would have at least been seriously injured. I managed to swerve out of the way at the last second, and I didn't hesitate to give a good middle finger for not turning on their headlights in those conditions. I still remember the car, bright blue Fiat Punto with black rims. A few days later, I saw the exact same car waiting at a yield sign as I and other vehicles passed by. I was on my way back to the pizzeria and had to turn left onto the same street they were on. Time to have a little fun. I passed extremely slowly in front of their car. As I passed the driver's window, I noticed it was slightly rolled down. I looked inside and saw the biggest, most intimidating guy, gym rat looking, wearing the most ridiculous sunglasses. Next to him, a beautiful blonde girl. The guy immediately started cursing and challenging me, and like an idiot I said, "Come at me." I heard myself say it and regretted it instantly because this was not the kind of guy I wanted to fight. Sure, I'm a pretty tall guy, but that dude, no way. So I sped away from that car as fast as I could, but moments later, to my surprise, the Fiat appeared in my rearview mirrors, and now the guy was chasing me. I was riding as fast as I could, but with him in a car, he could easily catch up to me. A roundabout was coming up, which I knew I could take easily at full speed, but of course the car couldn't take it as fast. This slowed him down only for a moment, but it only took a few seconds for him to catch up again. Now he was glued to my rear bumper and I was scared. As if that wasn't enough for him, he decided to drive right alongside me, with the passenger window rolled down, yelling at me to stop so we could talk. Well, I wasn't going to do that. He was getting closer to me, the girl staring at me the whole time. Our vehicles were almost touching sides at this point. I saw a golden opportunity, a side street to my right. I braked the rear wheel and skidded into the street. I didn't mean to lock the rear wheel, but I assure you it looked cool. But this wasn't the end, as the guy saw it coming and braked as well. Once again, he was right behind me. Suddenly, I saw a narrow alleyway to the left. I sharply turned left, and the blue Fiat knew it wouldn't fit. I rode back to the pizzeria as fast as I could. I still sometimes see that bright blue Fiat and hide or quickly turn onto another street to avoid it as much as I can.